Hey there. Let's slip quietly into the shadowy corridors of ancient Egypt, where your bedtime story isn't just about kings and pyramids. It's about you, a living god with a crown that pinches and a family tree shaped like a pretzel. Tonight, you'll see why being born into royalty is less happily ever after and more constant performance anxiety. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll find out the one thing a pharaoh dreads more than a rival army, and it's hiding right under your own roof. If you enjoy these wry little journeys through history's most absurd bedrooms, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you mean it. And while you're settling in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Let's see how many of us are up late unraveling ancient scandals together. Now, dim the lights, get cozy, maybe fluff up your pillow, and prepare to drift through the strangest royal childhood you never asked for. Ready? Because you've just been born, and congratulations, it's already a disaster. While most babies get a lullaby and a cuddle, your first moments are a public spectacle. You're not just a tiny squirming bundle of joy, you're the main event in Egypt's ongoing cosmic drama. Priests in suspiciously eyeliner, heavy makeup, circle you, muttering sacred formulas, sniffing for omens, and eyeing you like a particularly unreliable weather forecast. You're not just a baby, you're a divine press release. Somewhere in a shadowy temple, a nervous scribe is chiseling your name onto a tablet, hoping you won't be the kind of god king who fires people for misspelling it. Even your first breath is a source of national panic. Did you sneeze? That's either a sign of future prosperity or an immediate crisis, depending on which astrologer is consulted. The sacred cows are mooing, the stars are shifting. Meanwhile, you're just trying to figure out how to wiggle your toes. And while other newborns are left to drool and nap, you're being bundled into ceremonial linens so stiff and scratchy, you'd trade your tiny golden rattle for a regular cotton blanket in a heartbeat. Childhood, as most people know it, will not be making an appearance. Forget the idea of toys. Your first playthings are ritual scepters you're absolutely forbidden to chew on, no matter how much your gums ache. Instead of lullabies, you get sacred hymns performed by priests with the combined vocal charm of a funeral and a garlic festival. Your crib? A cold, gold-plated monstrosity that looks impressive in state portraits and feels about as cozy as a marble bench after midnight. Your caretakers hover, not out of love, but out of terror that you'll sneeze, roll over, or display some other undignified mortal behavior that might be interpreted as an apocalyptic sign. You're not bottle-fed, you're force-fed expectations. Every burp is scrutinized for omens. Every coup is evaluated for leadership potential. You're barely sitting up, and the palace is already buzzing about your education, your divine aura, and, let's not forget, your eventual spouse, who, spoiler alert, will be more genetically similar to you than your own reflection. From the moment you can focus your eyes, you're told you're not just royal, you're divine. That's not a metaphor. You are literally expected to believe, deep down in your soft little bones, that the sun rises because you exist. It sounds adorable, until you realize that if the sun happens to be a little late, everyone blames you. That's a lot of pressure for someone who still needs help holding their own head up. You might imagine that being a child, God comes with certain perks, no chores, no homework, endless Nile-side picnics. The reality is a schedule that would make a Fortune 500 CEO weep. Your day starts before sunrise. The priests are already chanting. Your nanny is replaced by a steward with a stone-faced expression and a golden tablet outlining your daily responsibilities. Spoiler, nap time never makes the list. Your first lesson is hieroglyphs, not your average ABCs, but a system of birds, eyes, and weirdly specific bread loaves, each one a potential minefield. One tiny mistake, and you might accidentally curse half of Upper Egypt or declare war on the fish. Next up is religious training. You're quizzed on the secret names of the gods, the proper method for blessing cucumbers, and the correct number of blinks during an offering. Mess it up, and the priest gives you a glare so chilling you'd swear you just insulted Ra's mother. Math isn't for counting your allowance, it's for monument building. You learn geometry, so you can someday instruct a team of sweaty laborers how to stack 2 million limestone blocks into a perfect pyramid. No pressure, unless you're a fan of leaning. Pyramids and national embarrassment. Public speaking is a must. After all, you're expected to address crowds who believe you have a direct line to the weather gods. There's no ad-libbing. If you mumble or misspeak, you might accidentally tank the grain market or cause a minor uprising. Then there's military strategy. You're 10 years old, and your closest experience to battle is fighting over figs at lunch. But now you're drilled on river crossings, battle formations, and how to slip. Smite the Nubians into casual conversation. Instead of philosophy, you get crash courses in maintaining ma'at, the cosmic balance, which translates roughly to don't let the crops fail, the peasants riot, or the priests start a rumor that you're lazy. All of this unfolds under the constant surveillance of tutors who double as informants and triple as walking bundles of nerves. They critique your every gesture, note your every question. At the end of the day, your brain feels like a storage room stuffed with symbols, schedules, sacred laws, and enough political paranoia to keep you scanning the shadows long after bedtime. When it comes to social life, forget about playground friendships. Every child you meet is a walking, talking threat assessment. That cheerful boy who races you through the palace gardens, he's the high priest's son, the one who always seems a little too eager to play board games, nephew of a general. And the girl you actually want to talk to? Sorry, she's already promised your cousin, for reasons involving dynastic stability and absolutely zero romance. You're not surrounded by friends, you're drowning in potential rivals. Everyone smiles, but only because your approval could make or break their family's future. That's not friendship, that's a networking event with better linen. Your tutors report back on your every move. Did you show a spark of independence? Congratulations, you're clever, and a little bit dangerous. Did you question a ritual? That's either heresy or, at best, a sign you need more incense exposure. Did you ask, just once, if your cousin could stop staring at you during lunch? That's going in the scroll, possibly under potential for instability. Privacy is a foreign concept. Try sneaking away for a moment of fun, and someone immediately alerts palace security. You, the divine one, must never be left unattended, lest you wander off and inspire a theological crisis. Show the slightest hint of favoritism, and suddenly 3 noble families are plotting your downfall over breakfast. So, you adapt. You become polite, cautious, the master of meaningless compliments. You perfect the art of laughing at jokes you don't understand, and pretending to admire tunics that look like someone lost a bet with a basket weaver. Every friendship is carefully managed, every word chosen to avoid offense. Because in this palace, one wrong move means your playmate today could be your assassin tomorrow, or worse, your brother-in-law. And then it happens. The moment you're officially declared divine. Not just royal, but actually a living god. The physical incarnation of Horus. The priests confirm it. The scrolls declare it. And the people bow so low you worry someone's going to sprain something. You are the reason. The Nile rises. The crops grow. And the taxes never seem to go down. Too bad nobody asked if you wanted this. Every sneeze is a divine message. Every step is a ritual. Each mistake must be spun, so it doesn't look like the gods are having an off day. But here's the punchline. While you're paraded as Horus, you still stub your toe, still get awkward pimples, and still suffer from digestive disasters after one too many figs at dinner. Divine? Maybe. Immune to embarrassing bodily functions? Not a chance. You're told you control everything, yet you can't even leave the palace without a bodyguard phalanx, a trio of priests, and a mob of courtiers who act like your shadow is plotting a coup. You're supposed to manage the cosmic balance, but if you so much as trip over a cat, half the kingdom starts whispering about omens. And the rituals. Oh, the never-ending rituals. Every meal is sanctified, every conversation laced with divine phrases. You have to attend ceremonies where you pretend to defeat evil using props that weigh more than your ego, all while sweating through a tunic that's basically ancient. Egypt's answer to the wool sweater. Privately, maybe you're bored, maybe you're terrified, maybe you're quietly plotting your escape to a nice, anonymous farm. But you can't admit that. Admitting doubt is the fastest way to end up, replaced by a cousin who's better at pretending to be infallible. So you keep up the act. You bless statues, wave from balconies, endure endless rituals, and wonder if the gods before you secretly hated this job just as much as you do. The truth is, being a god isn't freedom. It's a never-ending performance, and the only standing ovation comes from people who are paid to clap. Now, just as you're getting used to the idea of being worshipped, puberty crashes in like a sandstorm at a banquet. Your voice betrays you. Your body rebels. And before you can even grow your first patchy pharaoh beard, the advisors show up with a scroll and a forced smile. It's time to get married. Preferably to your sister. Yes, your sister, or your cousin, or your aunt. In this family, genetic diversity is a rumor, not a practice. Romance? Irrelevant. Personal preference? Not on the agenda. What matters is the appearance of divine legitimacy, and nothing says chosen by the gods like marrying someone who shares your cheekbones, your last name, and probably your childhood nanny. The palace erupts into excited debate. Officials argue over which relative is technically least related, as if it's a sacred puzzle. The priests are delighted. The bloodline remains untouched by the scandal of fresh DNA. The servants start a betting pool. You do your best to look dignified, pretending this is perfectly normal, all while rehearsing your "I'm thrilled to marry my sibling" face in the mirror. And the fun doesn't stop at marriage. You're expected to produce an heir quickly. Never mind that you're still discovering what your own body can do. All of Egypt is counting on your teenage hormones to deliver the next divine ruler, and nobody seems concerned about the potential for 3 elbows or an extra eyebrow or 2. Through it all, you keep up the charade. You attend banquets, parade with your new bride, who, let's be honest, is probably also your niece, smile for the crowds, and convince yourself it's all for the good of Egypt. Because, really, what's a little inbreeding when the fate of the cosmos is at stake? This is the royal puberty package: confusion, denial, and a family tree that's less a tree and more a tightly wound wreath. The only thing more twisted than the court's logic is the way you have to pretend it's all perfectly divine. So as you finally trade your childhood for a crown, remember, the higher the pedestal, the lonelier the view. Next, we'll step into the real heart of the job, the rituals, responsibilities, and very real dangers of being pharaoh. Because you've finally been crowned pharaoh. And that, my friend, is when the real performance begins. Supreme ruler, living god, poster child for cosmic order, and, let's be honest, probably already sweating through your ceremonial linen. This is what it really means to be pharaoh. You might think the job comes with luxury and endless adulation, but let me set the scene. The first thing they do is glue a fake beard to your chin, with what feels suspiciously like old honey, then strap a golden cobra to your forehead. You're already less divine monarch, and more nervous museum mannequin with lower back issues. Let's talk crowns. Forget the delicate Instagrammable tiaras you may have pictured. Your royal headgear is a beast, a double-layered monstrosity made of leather, stiff linen, and sometimes actual hammered metal. It's like shoving your head into a vintage suitcase, then balancing a symbolic houseplant on top for good measure. The double crown, combining the red of Lower Egypt and the white of Upper Egypt, is less an accessory and more a medieval kettlebell challenge. Each time you nod, your vertebrae file a formal complaint. Then come the ceremonial outfits. You're wrapped in a look that screams divine authority, but feels like an endurance test. Long white kilts with pleats as sharp as your paranoia, leopard skin sashes that never sit right, and golden breastplates that catch enough sun to fry a locust. Linen clings in places you didn't know could chafe, and gold doesn't breathe. It just traps all that sacred sweat inside. Fidgeting is forbidden, even if you feel a scarab beetle launching an expedition up your shin. And sandals, forget it. These are not the plush, memory foam slides you see in spa commercials. Egyptian royal sandals are basically papyrus flip-flops, flat as the desert, designed to showcase your divine toes while giving your arches the day off, permanently. Every step is a reminder that, in the ancient world, style always beat comfort. You start to wonder if the real reason pharaohs are always depicted sitting is because their feet can't take another parade. But here's the thing. None of this is optional. You're not just playing dress-up for the gods. Every hemline, every feather, every bit of gold stuck to your person means something cosmic. Choose the wrong color, and suddenly you're signaling weak leadership, or worse, calling down a drought. Wear the wrong sash, and the priests start whispering about omens. The stakes are high. You're not just an over-accessorized monarch. You're a walking, sweating, slightly itchy symbol of universal stability. No pressure. And those ceremonies. Picture this. You're standing in the sun for hours, sweating under 30 pounds of tradition, while priests circle you, chanting about how the fate of the cosmos hinges on your posture. You can't slouch. You can't yawn. You definitely can't ask, "Hey, can we maybe skip the part where we rub sacred oil on all 43 statues before breakfast?" Because every ritual is national theatre. The priests perform, the scribes furiously take notes, and the onlookers give you that look, half awe, half, "I hope he doesn't trip." Meanwhile, you're trying not to pass out. Your throne might be gold, but ergonomics haven't been invented yet. The only thing heavier than the crown on your head is the expectation that you wear it like you're enjoying yourself. You are, in theory, the most powerful person in the world. In practice, you're a glorified prop in a never-ending religious pageant. Divinity, it turns out, is exhausting. Every time something goes wrong, too much rain, too little rain, a mouse sneezing in a temple, everyone looks straight at you. Clearly, Pharaoh has lost favor with the gods. The crops fail. That's your fault. The Nile floods too much or not enough. All eyes on you. Someone stubs their toe on a temple step. People whisper that maybe you sneezed wrong during last week's incense wave. Forget being king. You're the designated scapegoat for cosmic hiccups. And here's the best part. You're expected to have answers for everything. Your role isn't just to rule or look pretty in gold. You're also spiritual mechanic, expected to keep the sun rising, the river flowing, and the universe spinning in perfect order. If the sun rises crooked, no one blames the weather. They blame you. Why is there a plague of frogs, the people ask. You can't just shrug and say, "Honestly, I have no idea." You have to invent a new ritual on the spot, chant a few lines, and hope the priests buy it. Even your dreams aren't safe. If you have a nightmare, the next morning your court astrologers gather like a flock of concerned pigeons, scribbling down your subconscious as if it's state policy. Bad dream? That's a new temple, stat. Headache, national omen. Wake up late? Scribes jot it down as a sign of impending chaos. Sneeze too many times before breakfast. Somewhere, a goat gets sacrificed, just in case. And if things go seriously wrong, famine, plague, uprising, or crocodile incident, the people don't say, "Wow, nature is wild." The rumor mill starts churning. Maybe Pharaoh is weak, or maybe the gods want a new Pharaoh. Suddenly, that cousin of yours, who's oddly popular with the army, starts looking less like family and more like a problem. You parade through the palace, draped in enough gold to blind a marble statue, surrounded by incense and bodyguards. But you can't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone's building a new statue or digging a new tomb. Either way, you're not invited to the unveiling. Being Pharaoh isn't just about issuing decrees. It's about absorbing the blame for every mosquito bite, every muddy riverbank, every undercooked sacrificial goose. When you're a living god, there's no such thing as an honest mistake. The universe stubs its toe, and you're the one apologizing for not controlling the cosmic furniture. Your mornings are a fever dream of ritual and paranoia. Forget the gentle sound of rain or a nice breakfast. Your wake-up call is a pack of priests chanting and waving incense, already judging your posture before you even open your eyes. Where normal mortals might reach for a strong coffee, you get a bracing splash of ice-cold sacred water, presumably sourced from the most hypothermia-inducing pool in Egypt. You shiver your way straight into wardrobe, not because you want to look fabulous, but because every fold of linen must be blessed, pre-folded, and probably ironed with starlight. Half awake, you're being wrapped in more layers than a winter tourist in Chicago. Chest plate shaped like a falcon. Check. Linen so crisp it could cut papyrus. Check. Sandals that double as torture devices. Double check. You're not even at breakfast, and you already need a nap. Then, the real work begins. Rituals. You shuffle into the temple, where a priest unrolls a scroll longer than your patience. You're guided through a series of sacred gestures. Hand here, nod there, squint at a statue, mutter the name of a god you haven't thought about since you were a kid. The stakes. Universal harmony, obviously. One wrong move, one mispronounced syllable, and suddenly you're to blame for the Nile drying up, the cows getting weird, or the moon looking a bit off color. These rituals are marathons, not sprints. Hours can go by as you stand stock, pretending your divine leg isn't asleep. You can't yawn. You can't scratch. You certainly can't suggest taking a break. This isn't just religious obligation. This is the Super Bowl of national performance art. The priests are in full dramatic mode. The scribes are scribbling like their lives depend on it, and the audience is watching every twitch, every bead of sweat. You, meanwhile, are silently praying for a mosquito to bite someone else for once. And all this happens before you get to anything resembling actual ruling. Your day is governed by astrology, omens, and a ceremonial checklist that makes modern tax season look like a beach vacation. By the time the sun's up, you're already exhausted, with a dozen more rituals, 3 public appearances, and a carefully rehearsed divine smile still ahead. Now, let's talk about trust. You're the most powerful person in Egypt, which means everyone around you is either acting like your best friend or quietly plotting how to replace you. Your guards. Sure, they're loyal, until someone offers them enough gold, cattle, or spiritual perks. Your advisors. Smiling, nodding, and never failing to remind you how well liked your cousin is with the army. Even your cupbearer is suspiciously eager to serve your drinks, like he wants you to notice how definitely not poisoned they are. The royal family. Don't get me started. They're less a family and more an audition lineup for your job. Half-brothers, ambitious uncles, cousins, named Ramses, who eye your sandals a little too hungrily. Every hallway conversation is a game of guess who's plotting. Every banquet could be your last supper. You can't sit on a chair without wondering if the cobra carved into it is purely decorative or an early retirement plan. And the paranoia, completely justified. Assassination is practically a competitive sport in your palace. If you die suddenly, it's always called a divine mystery, which is code for someone got creative with date wine and a scorpion. So, you develop survival habits, food tasters, random servant rotations, daily routines shuffled like a deck of cards. Not because it guarantees safety, but because it makes getting rid of you a logistical headache. Sleep, that sweet myth, is a rare luxury. You rest in a room guarded by 3 locks, a ceremonial dagger stashed under your pillow, and a sentry at the door working very hard on his innocent expression. You drift off knowing that, statistically, you're probably the only person in the palace who isn't plotting to be Pharaoh. But the real strain isn't dodging conspiracies. It's pretending you're blissfully unaware of them. You have to act calm, godlike, entirely unbothered, because showing fear is a flashing neon sign that you're vulnerable. Vulnerability is opportunity, and opportunity is what everyone else is waiting for. Every smile, every handshake, every compliment could be the first move in someone else's campaign for your throne. Trust the wrong person, and you won't have to worry about politics ever again. Being Pharaoh is less about ruling and more about surviving in a palace full of bowing courtiers by day and would-be usurpers by night. You are the cosmic anchor, the divine face of order, the person everyone blames when the universe hiccups. And under all the gold and ceremony, you're just one more anxious, sleep-deprived human, hoping you can keep the act going one more day. And as you peel yourself out of your 20 pounds of sacred linen and prepare for another round of public adoration or public scrutiny, you can't help but wonder what fresh cosmic disaster or palace intrigue tomorrow will bring. Because, as you're about to see, being Pharaoh wasn't just about rituals and ceremonial discomfort. It meant stepping out every day into the harsh spotlight of public life, where every gesture and decision could tip the scales of power. As Pharaoh, you were expected to be many things. You, dear Pharaoh, are the star of the world's hottest reality show. Except there's no commercial break, and the producers are your ancestors, the gods, and the entire population of Egypt. Everyone expects you to be divine, wise, endlessly patient, and, above all, to look completely flawless while sweating through yet another sunrise in a golden chest plate that could double as a solar oven. Forget about privacy or personal space. Your entire existence is a performance, and the audience is relentless. From the moment you step outside your palace, let's be honest, more like stumble, because those sandals have the arch support of a wet leaf. You're swept into a whirlwind of ceremonies, so elaborate, they make the Oscars look like a backyard barbecue. The streets are jammed with people craning for a glimpse of you, the adoring, the suspicious, and the freeloaders hoping for a complimentary loaf of bread. You ride through the crowds on a chariot, waving with the serene composure of a deity, while secretly wondering if anyone would notice if you just fainted and let the horses carry you off into early retirement. Then there's the outfit. Picture yourself swaddled in layers of starched linen, draped with jewelry that clinks and tangles in the breeze, and topped with a ceremonial headdress engineered by someone who clearly hated airflow. The linen clings in awkward places, sweat trickles down your back, and your sandals squelch with every step, as if stuffed with Nile mud and ancient regret. The only thing more suffocating than the heat is the expectation that you'll look blissfully transcendent through it all. Ceremonial duties, they never stop. You'll spend hours waving incense around sacred cows, slicing through oversized ribbons with a gold-plated knife, and graciously accepting offerings from nobles who smile too much and definitely have an agenda. You're expected to recite blessings, nod serenely, and utter, "May the gods favor you," even as you're mentally begging for a cold drink, a quiet corner, or a single moment without someone scrutinizing your every twitch. The sun, of course, is your ever-present judgmental spotlight. It beats down with the subtlety of a tax collector, melting your makeup, drying your eyes, and leaving you with the distinct impression that Ra is just up there watching, munching popcorn. And if you dare to show the tiniest hint of exhaustion, one misplaced yawn, one fleeting scowl, the rumor mill kicks into overdrive. Suddenly, you're not just a little tired, you're a sign of cosmic disorder. Pharaoh is displeased, they whisper. Pharaoh's favor is fading. Miss one sacred goose blessing, and next thing you know, there are mutterings about failed harvests and divine wrath. You sneeze in public, and the priests are already chiseling out new omens behind your back. Your entire legacy can hinge on whether you looked properly radiant during the barley festival, or, heaven forbid, sported a slightly crooked sash. Even the festivals, which sound like a break, are just more chances to perform. You're dragged to endless banquets, where you're not allowed to eat more than a ceremonial fig, watched over dances where your only job is to look approving, and forced to star in religious plays about your own life, where you play yourself, but with fewer lines than a silent extra. It's not a party, it's pageantry. And you're the main act every single time, whether you like it or not. By the end of the day, you limp back to the palace, drenched in sweat, dust, and the lingering scent of incense, asking yourself how many more statues you'll need to bless before the gods finally let you sleep. Let's not forget the part everyone skips over in the bedtime stories. Behind your dazzling public image is the shadowy power of the priests. The temples are not just houses of worship. They're ancient Egypt's answer to Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and the IRS rolled into one. They control the grain, the gold, the land, and even your reputation. Every temple is like a private kingdom, and every high priest is a CEO in a linen robe. Don't let the humble chanting fool you. These men are strategists, power brokers, and the original spin doctors. They decide what gets recorded, what gets erased, and which rumors should be whispered near the palace gates. The priesthood manages the gods, the omens, the festivals, and, most importantly, your image. If you sneeze at the wrong moment, they'll declare it a sign that the Nile will run dry. If you wear the wrong color, suddenly Ra is sulking and the barley market crashes. And the temples? Tax exempt, of course. They hoard their riches with the smug assurance that nobody, not even the living God, can touch their golden jackal statues or their well-funded retirement plans. Meanwhile, you're left juggling the treasury, praying for a good harvest, or considering a little light extortion from the merchants just to keep the palace lights on. The real kicker is that the priests love to remind you how devoted they are to your will. We exist only to serve you, Divine One, they say, while quietly redirecting resources, swapping secrets with your rivals, and advising your enemies to try a little more prayer, and maybe a little less loyalty. You're the face on the coins, the star in the parade. But they're the ones who decide how shiny you're allowed to be this week. Push back too hard, and you risk open rebellion. Bow to their demands, and you become a glorified mascot, paraded out for blessings and photo ops, but never really in control. So, as Pharaoh, your public life is a tightrope walk between divine perfection and human exhaustion, with every misstep magnified by a priesthood that's equal parts boardroom and gossip column. You're the living God, but they're the committee that decides if you still get to be divine by lunchtime. It's a kingdom of incense and passive aggression, where every day is a new episode of Will Pharaoh Snap? Spoiler, the answer is always not yet, but only because the gods haven't signed off on your time off request. But if you think the crowds and the priests are stressful, just wait until you get home. Because in the next chapter, we're diving headfirst into the palace, where family drama makes public life look like a relaxing spa day. After all, in most families, drama means someone forgot a birthday or made a snide comment at dinner. In yours, well, let's just say the stakes are a little higher. But for you, Pharaoh, family drama has a body count. Here, a minor squabble at dinner could spiral into a full-blown conspiracy, a midnight coup, or, if you're unlucky, an accidental encounter with the crocodile enclosure. In your world, the real threat isn't some enemy army storming the gates. It's the charming cousin, standing just a little too close, the brother who's always helpful, and the son who keeps asking about your will. You grew up in a palace so crowded with siblings, half-siblings, uncles, step-uncles, cousins, and the occasional ambiguous companion, that you could hardly turn around without bumping into someone eyeing your crown. Every relative was a possible rival, and every rival was a potential headline. Palace favorite found at bottom of sacred pool, tragic accident, or divine retribution. Some of your relatives had ambition, some had delusions, and all of them had a dangerous mix of both. Family game night in the palace. That's just a polite way of saying live-action succession. Let's talk about succession for a moment, because in Egypt, the rules are less firstborn gets the lot, and more last one standing wins the throne. There's no tidy system, no guarantee that your oldest child, or even your favorite, will inherit. It's an open contest of survival, persuasion, and sheer luck, with a side of priestly approval. Half the court spends their days speculating about which of your children will end up as the next god king, while the other half are actively sabotaging the competition to make sure the wrong child doesn't win out. Your family tree isn't so much a lineage as a battlefield. Your own children are raised less like kids and more like racehorses, each groomed, trained, and paraded around with tutors, spies, and political sponsors. Their mothers, yes, plural, because you're expected to keep a full roster of wives for maximum dynastic confusion. Whisper bedtime stories that always end with the gods choosing the most handsome and clever heir, which, for some reason, always seems to be their own child. Subtle, right? Meanwhile, your brothers and uncles refuse to play supporting roles in your personal epic. Each one quietly amasses loyal generals, builds up a shadow fan club, and develops an alarming expertise in accidental. Staircase tumbles. You can't even enjoy a fruit platter without wondering if it's a gift or a test. And then, of course, there are the queens. Multiple queens, all living under the same gorgeous, heavily perfumed roof, each one armed with alliances and vendettas that would put any reality show cast to shame. One wrong look from you at the wrong queen, and suddenly the kitchen staff is finding creative excuses to swap out your wine taster. The palace isn't a home. It's a very ornate, very expensive cage, and everyone in it is either related to you, working for you, or plotting to become you. Death doesn't even bring peace. If anything, funerals crank the drama to 11. Every time someone gets sick, the entire palace goes on high alert. A cough. Must be poison. A fever. Definitely a curse. A stomachache. Could be bad figs. Or could be your nephew's latest power move. The temple priests become part-time coroners and full-time gossip columnists, dissecting every death for signs of foul play. Even your own funeral is a social event with a side of murder mystery and burial. Good luck. Tombs are supposed to secure your legacy, but in reality, they're just invitations for trouble. Your own loyal son might finish your pyramid, only to immediately start chiseling out your name to make room for his own. Because nothing says filial devotion like a quick round of legacy erasure. That's the real sting of kingship. The people who know you best are the ones most likely to quietly, permanently remove you. Politely, of course. There's always a fig leaf of respect, But you know better. The palace is a snake pit, and you're the juiciest mouse. So after a lifetime of performing divine rituals, sweating through 100 layers of ceremonial linen in the sun, and dodging family assassination attempts, you finally die. You might think you've earned a nap, maybe some peace. Not in Egypt. Here, death is just the start of your next gig. Full-time spiritual mascot, part-time horror story, and occasional museum exhibit. The embalming crew arrives before your body is even cold. They get to work with the enthusiasm of a team competing for a reality show prize. First, they scoop out your internal organs, heart, lungs, guts, the whole lot, and tuck them into canopic jars, each one guarded by an animal-headed deity. Picture it, your liver, now watched over by a falcon, your stomach guarded by a jackal. It's like assembling a supernatural Pokemon team, except much more slippery. Then comes the brain. Tradition says it has to go, so out it comes, via a hook up the nose, of course. Not because it's useless, mind you, but because someone thousands of years earlier decided that the afterlife works better without brains. Who are you to argue with tradition? Next, you're stuffed with resin-soaked linens and natron salt, until you're basically a sacred raisin, wrapped tighter than the palace tax records. If you thought ceremonial robes were uncomfortable, try being the world's most overdressed prune. Now for the coffins. Yes, plural. You're not just buried in one box, you're packed into a series of increasingly fancy coffins, each one more gilded and inscribed than the last. Think of it as a divine matryoshka doll, only instead of cute painted faces, it's spells, curses, and prayers for safe passage. All this, just in case you run into any rude ghosts on your way to the afterlife. But the true pièce de résistance. The tomb itself, a megalomaniac's dream. You spend half your reign, and most of Egypt's GDP, constructing a mausoleum that's basically a 3D billboard for your immortality. The walls are crammed with prayers, spells, and those delightfully awkward images of you smiting enemies who, let's be honest, won't be bothering anyone ever again. It's an architectural scream for attention, and unfortunately, also an open invitation to every ambitious tomb robber in a 50-mile radius. Despite all the curses, booby traps, and guards you set up, most pharaohs' tombs last about as long as a good fruit basket. Sometimes they're looted within decades, sometimes within hours. So while your high priests are mumbling prayers for your eternal soul, somewhere out there, a gang of opportunistic workmen is sprinting off with your gold-plated footstool and giggling about your mummified nose. But here's the twist. In Egypt, being forgotten is an even bigger disaster than being robbed. If your name gets scratched off, if your tomb is defaced, or if your mummy winds up in a museum display case with a little plaque that spells your name wrong, you don't get to enjoy the afterlife at all. One bureaucratic slip, and you're stuck haunting the dreams of some overworked scribe for all eternity. You could have been king of the world, but end up as an anonymous skeleton, waiting for someone to remember who you were. It gets better. If you're lucky, your legacy is just erased. If you're unlucky, it's rewritten. Suddenly, your big military disaster is retconned into a glorious victory. Your mild-mannered personality is upgraded to ferocious lion of the battlefield. That embarrassing incident with the crocodile is conveniently left out. The next generation treats your life like a group project they forgot to study for. You become a legend, but not the legend you wanted, more like a meme to make the new guy look good. And let's not forget the truly undignified afterlife, waiting many pharaohs, the modern museum. After millennia of careful tomb construction, what's your reward? Your mummified remains are unwrapped under bright fluorescent lights, poked and prodded by archaeologists, and then displayed in a glass box for tourists who can't even pronounce your name. That priceless gold mask you spent a fortune on. It's now a selfie backdrop for middle school field trips. Your royal toenail clippings are catalogued, tagged, and possibly for sale in the gift shop. Authentic Pharaoh, now in keychain form. So much for divine status. You ruled empires, commanded armies, and controlled the fates of millions. Now you're climate controlled, surrounded by security cameras, and discussed by bored college students on a sleep-deprived field trip. Divine order, meet the gift shop checkout line. For all the pomp, all the rituals, all the backstabbing relatives and linen-wrapped paranoia, you'd think history would at least give you a little respect, maybe a standing ovation. But no, the real kicker is that your entire legacy is out of your hands. You can spend your whole life building temples, carving your name on every obelisk, and being buried under a mountain of gold. But all it takes is one ambitious nephew with a chisel, and suddenly you never existed. Your name is gone. Your statues are recycled, and your achievements are reassigned to your great-nephew, who ruled for about 6 minutes, and claimed to be the son of the sun, and, incidentally, the greatest pharaoh ever. Erasing a name in Egypt isn't just petty, it's spiritual murder. If nobody speaks your name, your soul gets stuck in cosmic limbo. Basically, the world's worst sleep with no dreams, no rest, just endless waiting. All because your descendants wanted your pyramid money for their own projects. Even if they don't erase you, they just rewrite you. Your flops become epic wins, your quirks become virtues, and your entire personality gets a PR makeover you never asked for. And the humiliation doesn't stop there. Thousands of years later, the tomb you designed to keep out the world is cracked open by archaeologists in sensible khakis. Suddenly, you're under fluorescent lights, dissected for history documentaries, and your carefully preserved body is the star attraction for selfie stick-wielding tourists. Your gold mask is a photo op, your mummified remains are a cautionary tale, and your royal secrets are now public record. That's right, your afterlife is sponsored by the local museum gift shop. So, here's the punchline. You were the living god, the chosen of Ra, the lord of 2 lands, and your greatest posthumous honor is being slightly misrepresented by a travel blogger with a questionable sense of humor. Maybe that's the most honest legacy a pharaoh can have, immortalized, but never really understood. And with that, let's leave the sand-blasted corridors of Egypt behind for a moment. Because if you think royal family drama was rough in the land of pyramids, just wait until you see how the Vikings handled it. Next up, Harald Sigurdsson enters the world in the year 1015, screaming, we assume, into a kingdom already on fire. Nordic family intrigue, exile, mercenary adventures, and a king who never learned to sleep with both eyes closed, coming right up. You don't get a peaceful childhood when you're born into Viking royalty. You, Harald Sigurdsson, don't enter the world in 1015 to the sound of a lullaby or a gentle cradle rocking. No, you arrive, probably howling, as babies do, into a Norway already burning from end to end. Picture it. Your half-brother, Olaf Haraldsson, is swinging axes and peddling sermons, desperate to jam the country together under one shiny Christian crown. The local nobles hate his guts. The Danes are sharpening their blades, just waiting for the chance to send him packing. And all those old pagan rituals, they're cracking under the weight of this new divine kingship, which is just as much about politics as it is about God. So, instead of being swaddled in silk and handed a tiny gold crown, you're being raised in a world where the family dinner conversation is, who's betraying us this week? Let's talk about your family. Your father, Sigurd Syr, is technically a king, but in the same way that someone's the king of their backyard barbecue, respected, sure, but mostly a landowner with a bit of bling. He's more interested in livestock than intrigue, but he's not stupid. Your mother, Asta Gudbrandstatter, is a whole different saga. Ambitious, sharp as a knife, devoutly Christian, and basically the family's in-house political arsonist. Most importantly, she's also the mother of Olaf Haraldsson, who's already halfway to sainthood in the family group chat. So, congratulations, you're not just any prince. You're a backup prince, the bonus round, the little brother watching as the firstborn tries to glue a country together with faith, steel, and a lot of wishful thinking. But don't get any ideas about a normal childhood. From the moment you can walk, you're treated less like a child and more like a pawn in a never-ending, blood-soaked chess match. At age 10, you know how to hold a sword. By 11, you're riding a horse, probably before you know how to tie your own shoes. And by 15, forget adolescence. You're strapping on chainmail, prepping for battle, and trying to pretend you're not terrified. 15 is the magic number, because that's when the real fun begins. Olaf, your battle-scarred, ever-optimistic half-brother, has lost his throne to the Danes. He spent some time in exile. Think of it like a really depressing gap year, before deciding to come back and reclaim Norway for Christendom. He rallies a ragtag army of loyalists, and you, at the tender age of 15, find yourself riding next to him, straight into the meat grinder known as the Battle of Stiklestad. There's no war paint, no movie heroics, just a skinny teenager in oversized armor, clutching a sword and hoping nobody notices his hands are shaking. The battle is, in a word, catastrophic. Olaf is killed, hacked down before your eyes. You, wounded and probably more traumatized than you'll ever admit, barely escape into the mountains with the shattered remains of the army. Childhood officially ends right there, in the mud and blood of defeat. You're not a prince anymore. You're a fugitive, a survivor, a boy who's just seen what happens to dreamers in a world run by cutthroats. But here's the thing. Exile doesn't mean obscurity. Norway may have slammed the door in your face, but you're not about to vanish quietly. Instead, you limp east, dragging open wounds and unfinished business straight into the snowy wilderness and endless pine forests. Your destination. Kievan Rus, the Slavic Norse megastate, ruled by Yaroslav the Wise. Now, to most Norwegians, that's the end of the line, Siberia with better architecture. But to you, it's a second chance, a blank check for ambition. Arriving in Kiev is like stepping into a fever dream of politics and power. The city is a melting pot, equal parts Slavic, Norse, and Byzantine. Yaroslav, the man in charge, is clever, pragmatic, and, lucky for you, has a soft spot for exiled Viking royalty. Even better, his court is already packed with Norse mercenaries, all of them eager to swap stories and collect scars. You fit right in, but don't expect palace pampering. This is no spa retreat. You sign up for the rough stuff, fighting raiders, putting down rebellious princes, clashing with nomads on the steppe. Your sword earns you silver. But it's your tactical mind that turns heads. You're not just a brute swinging an axe. You're patient, slippery, always looking for the weak spot in the enemy's line. You don't just survive, you thrive. Yaroslav notices your knack for not dying, and, within a year, hands you command of your own troops. Suddenly, you're the boss, leading hard-bitten warriors in campaigns that would make most teenage princes run for the nearest monastery. There's even a rumor you fall for one of Yaroslav's daughters, but that's a juicy subplot we'll circle back to later. The important thing is, you're no longer a broken boy on the run. You're becoming something new, something dangerous. A warlord forged in exile, ambitious and unmoored, with nothing left to lose. But let's not kid ourselves. Kievan Rus is just a stepping stone. You're not here to play second fiddle forever. This is your forge, not your throne. As the 1030s roll on, your eyes drift south toward Constantinople, the richest, wildest city in the world. Imagine the skyline, endless domes, golden mosaics glittering in the sun. Walls so massive they make your old Norwegian forts look like garden fences. This city, known in Norse tales as Miklagard, is dripping with gold, intrigue, and the kind of decadent luxury that would make any Viking's head spin. The Byzantine emperor is always on the hunt for mercenaries, especially tall, terrifying Norsemen, with a reputation for surviving things that should kill most people. You decide it's time to make your move. This isn't just a career change, it's an invasion. One man, armed with ambition and a really sharp axe, ready to burrow his way into the very heart of the empire. So you bid a fond, possibly hungover farewell to Yaroslav's court, and set out for the city of silk, secrets, and backstabbing on an industrial scale. You arrive in Constantinople in the early N40s, and if you thought the palaces of Kiev and Rus were fancy, the Byzantine capital is on another level. The city is a riot of color and noise, the air thick with incense, the streets teeming with priests, merchants, and spies. The imperial palace is so blindingly opulent, you start to wonder if the floors are made of solid gold. Spoiler, they're not, but they sure look like it. You join the Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal hit squad. It's a mercenary dream team, Norse and Anglo-Saxon warriors, all recruited for their size, their loyalty, and their willingness to split a man in half if the emperor snaps his fingers. The uniform. Think chainmail meets haute couture, itchy, heavy, and guaranteed to chafe in the Mediterranean heat. You're supposed to look intimidating, not comfortable. But you're not just another axe for hire. You stand out, literally. You're tall, imposing, and your style of fighting is equal parts brutal and cunning. You rise quickly through the ranks, earning the trust of emperors and the side-eye of every courtier who's ever heard the phrase ambitious foreigner. Over the next few years, you rack up war stories like a medieval action hero. You battle Arab rebels in Sicily, chase pirates across the Aegean, march through Anatolia, and even make it as far as Jerusalem, where legend claims you take a dip in the Jordan River and swear an oath to someday rule a kingdom of your own. Of course, it's not all swordplay and sunbathing. Byzantine politics is a full-time blood sport, with more intrigue than a season of reality TV. Courtiers, generals, eunuchs, all of them smiling while they sharpen their knives behind your back. You learn to survive not just by fighting, but by watching, waiting, and never trusting anyone who offers you a drink without taking a sip first. You don't just win battles, you get rich. The spoils of war, imperial bribes, gifts from grateful nobles, all of it piles up. You earn enough gold to make your old Norwegian inheritance look like pocket change. Some say you even stash a secret treasure in Constantinople, just in case you need an escape fund. You swap out furs for silk, bronze for gold, and start to look less like a Viking exile and more like a Byzantine insider. You're not just surviving, you're thriving, adapting, evolving. But here's the catch. You're never going to be satisfied guarding someone else's throne, no matter how many silk robes you wear or how many palace banquets you attend. Eventually, the emperor starts seeing you as a threat, just another too rich, too popular mercenary who might get ideas. The palace rumor mill buzzes with whispers of plots and poisonings. And if you know anything about palace life, and believe me you do, you'll realize it's time to disappear before someone makes you vanish for good. You don't just slip out the back door. You escape the only way you know how, with a combination of guts, luck, and that particular brand of Viking stubbornness that got you through Stiklestad in the first place. After nearly a decade of fighting for foreign emperors, you're done being anyone's hired muscle. Your next destination? Home, Norway. But this time, you're not coming back as a penniless exile or an apologetic little brother. You're returning as a battle-hardened warlord, weighed down with Byzantine gold, trailed by seasoned mercenaries, and carrying a resume that makes most local kings look like amateurs. You've slept in more palace beds, worn more ceremonial hats, and survived more assassination plots than any of your rivals. The only thing you haven't done yet is rule. Of course, Norway isn't exactly rolling out the red carpet. There's already a king in place, Magnus the Good, your nephew, the illegitimate son of your dearly departed half-brother Olaf. Magnus is young, popular, and has managed to keep both Norway and Denmark under his thumb for a while. But what he doesn't have, your bank account, your battle scars, or your appetite for risk. So you do what any ambitious Viking with a chip on his shoulder might do. You hire an army. You spend your Byzantine treasure like it's going out of style, recruiting warriors from Kiev and Rus, Sweden, and anywhere else you can find men with more brawn than self-preservation. You strike a deal with Svein Estridsson, Magnus's rival in Denmark, a sort of mutual enemy of my enemy. Bromance that's equal parts strategic alliance and medieval group therapy. But the invasion never really happens. Magnus, realizing he's about to be caught in a civil war with more axes than allies, surprises everyone by offering a power-sharing deal. You agree. But let's be honest, sharing a throne with you is like handing a lion a seat at a sheep convention. The partnership is tense, awkward, and doomed from the start. 2 years in, Magnus dies. Some say illness. Others mumble about poison. But in the end, it doesn't really matter. You don't waste time mourning. You claim the throne for yourself and make it clear to everyone, from the lowest peasant to the prickliest bishop, that Norway finally has a king who's earned the crown the hard way. But you're still not satisfied. There's Denmark to consider, and you've already spent years hammering the Danish coast with raids, burning towns, seizing ships, and generally making life miserable for anyone who stands in your way. You leave a trail of plunder and smoldering resentment, but you never quite manage to hold the land. Denmark remains stubbornly out of reach, and Svein survives every ambush you throw his way. Still, Norway is yours, and you rule it like a man who knows what it costs to wear a crown. The rituals are just as absurd, the ceremonial robes just as itchy, and the paranoia just as thick as ever. You've got all the gold, all the scars, and all the enemies you could ever wish for. But you haven't forgotten England. No, your gaze starts to drift west, where even greater prizes and greater risks await. And that's where we'll pick up next. By the late 1040s, Harald Hardrada sat on the throne of Norway, not just as a warlord turned king, but as the last true Viking monarch. The final campaign is about to begin, and the end of an era is just over the horizon. Let's set the scene. You're Harald Hardrada, lounging on your Norwegian throne in the late 140s. You're not just any king, you're the living, breathing contradiction of every saga you've ever heard. On the one hand, you rule with the steel-fisted discipline you learned in Byzantium, sharpening your ambition every morning like you sharpen your sword. On the other, you're a walking cautionary tale for anyone who thinks being a king means sleeping in. You've made Norway into something it's never been before. A real kingdom with real rules, real taxes, and, let's not forget, a king who expects more than the occasional tribute in dried fish and flattery. You don't just want power, you want obedience first, then loyalty, if there's any left over. You don't ask for peace. You demand it. The nobles, they either bow their heads or mysteriously disappear. And no, you're not sending them on a cruise. You're not a tyrant, you tell yourself. Just a Viking king with a taste for imperial micromanagement. And, honestly, the locals have no idea what hit them. One day, they're running the old clan business. The next, you've got standing armies, fleets, minted coins, and the kind of church-building spree that would make any medieval influencer jealous. Of course, you never forget to remind the world that Norway isn't some snow-blasted backwater anymore. You're the king, and you're here to collect. If a local chieftain gets cocky, you send in the troops. If the peasants grumble about taxes, you send in the swords. Your style: less kindly patriarch, more Viking CEO with a boardroom of axes. But underneath all that, you're still a man who dreams, a man who's lost before and refuses to lose again. Surprisingly, there's a softer side to you, at least by Viking standards. You write poetry, mostly about yourself, because if you're not going to hype your own legend, who will? You bankroll skulls, those medieval hype men, to turn your exploits into verses that echo from the fjords to foreign courts. Your trade networks snake across Europe, and, just in case your piggy bank needs topping up, you keep a cozy correspondence with the Byzantine court. Never hurts to have a backup plan, especially if you've already retired from their imperial guard with a suspiciously large chunk of treasure. But even with all that culture, your real hobby is war. Specifically, waging it against Denmark. Every summer, like clockwork, you dust off your helmet, gather your fleet, and head south for another round with Sweyn Estridsson, your personal nemesis, and Denmark's resident headache. It's not really about land anymore. It's about pride. You can't let go, and Sweyn refuses to conveniently drop dead. These annual raids have become less about conquest and more about keeping your edge, and maybe reminding everyone, including yourself, that you're still the last word in Viking intimidation. By the early 1060s, though, even you have to admit you're not getting any younger. Grey at the temples, not quite as quick on the draw as you used to be. You start prepping your son, Olaf Kira, for the throne. You probably picture yourself fading out with a flourish, maybe dying in your sleep, surrounded by gold, loyal warriors, and a few recited stanzas of your greatest hits. But that's not how the universe works for Viking kings, especially not in the year 1066. Now, let's talk about 166. The year that every historian circles, underlines, and sprinkles with dramatic music. Edward the Confessor, England's king, drops dead without an heir, and suddenly, every ambitious noble and half-related monarch in Europe sees a vacancy sign blinking over the English throne. Harold Godwinson claims it. William of Normandy is sharpening his knives. And from the frozen north, you, yes, you, Harold, see one last chance to go down as more than just another king. You want England, not just for the loot, not just for old grudges, but because if anyone's going to be the last true Viking conqueror, it's going to be you. Let's pause for a second. Is your claim to the English throne solid? Absolutely not. It's stitched together from a half-remembered deal with King Nut, who once ruled England, and, let's be honest, probably never intended for you to cash in on it. But this is Viking logic at its finest. If you sail in with enough ships, any claim starts to look legitimate. You join forces with Tostig Godwinson, the embittered brother of England's new king. He promises you English support. You promise him the sharp end of a spear for anyone who disagrees. So you gather your fleet, about 300 longships, packed with over 10,000 warriors. This isn't a smash-and-grab raid. This is the full Viking experience. Banners flying, oars flashing. The kind of invasion that makes your ancestors' ghosts sit up and take notice. In September 10266, you land near the Humber and start marching toward York. The English are caught flat-footed, scrambling to throw together a defense. At the Battle of Fulford, you crush the local resistance under the Northern Earls, like so many overripe apples. York throws open its gates. For a moment, it feels like the old days, when the world trembled at the sight of a Viking sail. You set up camp at Stamford Bridge, feeling every inch the conqueror. You demand hostages, standard Viking procedure really, and your men finally get to relax after weeks of rowing and raiding. The weather is suspiciously mild. England looks ripe for the plucking. For a fleeting moment, you start to believe the legends about yourself. This isn't Byzantium's backroom politics. This is conquest, pure and simple. But fate, as you've learned, is a fickle gossip. While you're basking in your own myth, Harold Godwinson is pulling off one of the most insane troop movements in medieval history. He force marches his army north from London in under a week, covering nearly 200 miles in less than 4 days. No one expects him to arrive, especially not you. Your men are scattered. Most of them left their armor back at camp, expecting a friendly round of negotiations, not a full-on English welcoming committee. What happens next is less a battle and more a grim lesson in the dangers of believing your own hype. The English hit you at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066, and the Norwegians are caught with their metaphorical pants down. The initial chaos is legendary. Some of your warriors, probably still brushing crumbs out of their beards, scramble to form a shield wall with whatever weapons and armor they can grab. Others are cut down before they even register what's happening. And then there's the stuff of saga. A single Viking berserker, armed with a massive axe, holds the narrow bridge against wave after wave of English soldiers. He becomes an instant legend, supposedly felling over 40 men before someone finally sneaks under the bridge and skewers him with a spear. It's a testament to just how desperate things are. When kings start relying on bridge trolls and last stands, you know the script is about to flip. You finally get your bearings, rally your men, and try to form a proper shield wall. But it's too little, too late. The English archers start picking your warriors off, and then the cavalry slams into your flanks. The wall holds, cracks, and collapses. Through it all, you fight like the war god the songs claim you are, swinging a two-handed sword, towering above your men, roaring your last battle cry. For a moment, it almost feels heroic, almost mythic. And then, in the chaos, an arrow finds your throat. No final words, no time for a dramatic monologue, just blood, mud, and the end of an era. The reinforcements from your ships, led by your standard-bearer Eystein Aura, arrive too late. They charge into the melee in a doomed attempt to salvage the day, but all they find is slaughter. Eystein himself dies in what will be called Aura's Storm, a counterattack so desperate it just adds more Norse blood to the English soil. Out of your fleet of 300 ships, only 24 are needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. The message couldn't be clearer if it was carved in runes on stone. The age of Viking conquest is over. The longships will sail home, but their fire, the old Viking wildness, is gone. Your death at Stamford Bridge isn't just another failed campaign. It's the closing bell on the Viking Age itself. September 25th, 1066. That's the day the last Viking king goes down, fighting on a foreign field, sword in hand, lungs filling with blood. The world doesn't end with a bang, but with a cough and a splash of crimson, less saga, more messy reality. You had planned on negotiations. Instead, you get blindsided. Your men are caught unarmored and unprepared, and what follows is not a battle, but a massacre. But still, the Vikings don't surrender. They fight with the wild, cornered desperation only men cut off from home can know. That lone hero on the bridge, swinging his axe until the end, becomes the stuff of campfire legend for centuries. The English, for all their discipline, have to bully their way across the river, losing men to a single furious defender, until someone gets clever and ends the standoff from below. You, Harold, try to rally your scattered warriors. You order shield walls, but the formations are ragged, the men are exhausted, and the arrows keep falling. The cavalry hit hard, the shield wall buckles, and you're forced to fight like a berserker, wading into the carnage, sword swinging. According to the stories, you're a giant among men, and for a brief, blood-soaked moment, You live up to every overblown stanza ever sung about you. Then, the arrow. Not even a dramatic, slow-motion fall, just a sharp, choking end. No final speech. No time to curse your enemies or bless your son. Just the hard, cold ground and the knowledge that the Viking dream is over, not with the glorious conquest, but with the last, desperate gasp. By the time your reinforcements arrive, the field is already lost. Eystein Ore charges in, and his men are cut down almost to the last. The survivors limp back to the ships, and the entire invasion fleet, once a floating parade of power, is reduced to a handful of boats ferrying the broken and the defeated back to Norway. The consequences ripple out faster than any saga can keep up. Harold Godwinson, the English king, barely has time to catch his breath before he hears that William of Normandy has landed in the south. If you hadn't attacked when you did, Harold might have had more time to prepare for the next wave. Instead, England is battered and exhausted, and just 3 weeks after defeating you, Harold Godwinson marches south, only to be killed at Hastings by the Normans. In a way, you, Harold Hardrada, helped open the door for William the Conqueror. You didn't win the crown, but you broke the kingdom just enough to let someone else in. Back in Norway, the news of your death hits like a winter storm. The once invincible Harold, the hero of Russes, the scourge of Byzantium, the builder of Norway, is gone, felled far from home. Your son, Olaf Kyrre, takes the throne, and suddenly, Norway is a different place. Olaf isn't his father. He prefers peace to plunder, trade to terror. Under his rule, Norway stabilizes, and the wild Viking fire cools into something more like politics and commerce. The longships stop being weapons and start being merchant vessels. No more berserkers storming monasteries. No more sacrifices to the old gods on blood-soaked beaches. No more kings dreaming of silver across the western sea. The sagas? They're still sung, but now the heroes are ghosts, their deeds echoing in mead halls that grow quieter every year. Your life, Harold, is the Viking world's last great epic, a story that stretches from snowbound Norway to the golden roofs of Constantinople, from the steppes to English meadows. You were everything the Viking Age was, brave, ambitious, ruthless, and always in motion. And when you stopped moving, so did the Norse world. The Viking Age didn't end with a whimper, or with a grand coronation, but with you bleeding out on an English field, your name already turning into legend as the world quietly turned the page. The medieval world begins where your story ends, but your legacy, that's much trickier to bury. Centuries later, your story is the thunder in the background of every history lesson, every saga, every ballad. You're not just a king. You're a symbol, the last gasp of Viking ambition, the warning that history doesn't let anyone ride off into the sunset without consequences. Scholars still argue, were you a conqueror, a poet, a brute, or a builder? As usual, the truth is messier than the myth. You wrote poetry, but you also ordered raids that turned villages to ash. You built churches, but you filled fields with blood from Sicily to Stamford Bridge. You were both the sword and the pen, the destroyer and the creator. But no one doubts your scale. No other Viking traveled so far, fought so many wars, or piled up as much gold, glory, and grudges as you did. You served emperors, defied kings, and bent armies to your will. Most Norse leaders faded into legend with a couple of sagas and a gravestone. You, Harold, carved your name into 3 empires. Your poems survive. Your name echoes in the Heimskringla and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and modern filmmakers, writers, and history buffs are still trying to figure out how anyone could live that hard, that fast, for that long. Even your nickname, Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, is less of a slur and more of a weather warning. You didn't bend. You broke things, sometimes yourself. And you ruled the way you fought, with a fire in your veins and a blade in your hand. After your death, Norway changes. Olaf Kara brings peace and prosperity. Trade flourishes, the sword is sheathed, and the wild Viking days become stories to scare or inspire the next generation. But you, Harold, remain larger than life. In Norway, your image is stamped on coins, painted in churches, and whispered about in taverns. In Iceland, you're the star of every saga. In England, you're the cautionary tale about what happens when a king won't go quietly. In Byzantium, you're the northern ghost who once guarded emperors. You are the last Viking king. You died as you lived, chasing a crown, sword in hand, always rolling the dice on your own legend. When the longship stopped sailing and the mead halls fell silent, the world turned. But you, Harold, made sure it would never quite forget your name. And as the last echo of your saga fades, the world starts to wonder, what happens to a king and a people when the era of conquest is over? What becomes of all those longships once the terror of the seas? You want to know what it really means to go out in style as a Viking? Forget the velvet ropes and gold-plated hearses. For you, a Viking leader with a reputation to maintain and ancestors to impress, a ship isn't just a mode of transport, it's your entire brand, your cosmic business card, and, eventually, your one-way ticket out of this world. So, when your time's up, and the political backstabbing finally gets the better of you, nobody's just going to dig a shallow grave and call it a day. Oh no. Your funeral is about to become the hottest event on the fjord. Let's get this straight. To the Vikings, a ship was much more than planks and rivets. It was the Wi-Fi, the company car, and the family crest rolled into one. You built your reputation rating from its deck, showed off your bling in its stern, and when the curtain finally fell, you expected to leave the stage in it too. A ship burial wasn't some optional extra, like having doves at a modern wedding. It was considered absolutely fundamental, a sacred, non-negotiable clause in your afterlife contract. Why? Because for the Vikings, death wasn't the end. It was just the next leg of the journey. You'd spent your life sailing across stormy waters to unknown lands. Why should death be any different? The ship was your bridge to the next world. To us, this all sounds like poetic nonsense, but for your Viking PR team, it's the foundation of your entire legacy strategy. If you want to arrive in Valhalla with any sort of credibility, you'd better show up in something impressive. Now, let's talk about the hardware. These weren't your average fishing boats. We're talking about majestic longships, sometimes stretching 70 feet, with dragon-headed prows curling like a celebrity's signature. The woodwork was so intricate that even your palace craftsmen would have wept trying to copy it. And these ships weren't just for show. They had to look fierce enough to slice through not only the North Sea, but also whatever spiritual dimension your soul was expected to conquer next. The whole ritual kicks off once you're officially declared dead, possibly after a brief dramatic struggle involving some poisoned mead or a suspiciously slippery bathhouse floor. Your body is cleaned and dressed in only the finest garments your status can afford. Silk, if the family coffers are robust. Embroidered wool, if austerity measures are in effect. There's a strong chance someone will try to slip a bit of gold jewelry onto you, just in case you need to bribe the afterlife's customs officials. You're then arranged in the center of the ship, preferably on a bed or a thick pile of furs. You don't get to pick the pose, but rest assured, your surviving relatives will argue over whether you look more heroic, holding your sword, or more serene, with your eyes closed, pretending to sleep. Around you, the mourners begin piling in all the essentials. Weapons, of course. A sword, an axe, a shield, a spear. Because if there's one thing you've learned from a lifetime of succession, crises, it's that you never go anywhere unarmed. But there's more. Tools for the afterlife's DIY emergencies, your favorite cloak and boots, because even dead royalty shouldn't be seen in last season's fashion. Jewelry, naturally. And then things get a little more macabre. If you were important enough, your loyal slaves, horses, and even a hawk or two might be sacrificed to keep you company and handle whatever celestial chores you're too dignified to do yourself. Yes, even after death you delegate. To us, this all sounds like a scene from a particularly intense episode of Game of Thrones. To the Vikings, this is the ultimate expression of honor. Once your cosmic inventory is complete, the ship is buried beneath tons of earth. This isn't just about hiding the evidence. It's about turning your grave into a permanent monument, a mound so large that even future tourists with fanny packs can't miss it. These weren't just tombs, they were declarations. Here lies someone so important that even the gods had to make room. Now, here's where the stereotype shatters. Those blockbuster Viking funerals weren't just for men. Some of the grandest ship burials belonged to women, powerful queens, priestesses, and aristocrats who wielded as much influence in life, and it seems even in death, as their male counterparts. Take the famous Oseberg burial. Not only was the ship itself a ceremonial masterpiece, but its two occupants were women, one likely a queen or high-ranking seeress, the other perhaps a trusted companion or priestess. No knitting by the fire for these ladies. They went out surrounded by carved sledges, ornate chests, and an entire cart so decorative it could have doubled as mobile cathedral. And just to really set the mood, the Oseberg ship contained 2 sacrificed oxen at the prow. Not exactly a quiet, dignified farewell. More like a cosmic send-off with a side of barbecue. But let's not forget the Gokstad ship, the more battle-ready cousin, dug up in 1880. This one was all about speed and intimidation. Inside, the remains of a man in his 40s, a chieftain or warrior king, his name lost to history, but his reputation thoroughly preserved by the scale of his burial. Shields lined the sides of his ship like paparazzi flashes. Alongside his body were gaming pieces for those long afterlife nights, beds, weapons, and enough animal remains to make modern archaeologists do a double take: 12 horses, 6 dogs, and, because the afterlife should never be boring, 2 peacocks. Apparently, even in death, you need to flaunt your international connections. These graves tell us far more than just who had the biggest boat. They reveal a civilization obsessed with the journey between worlds, a people who believed the afterlife wasn't a place you waited for, but a destination you sailed to with style, backup, and plenty of animal sidekicks. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. Viking funerals weren't just sentimental family affairs. They were highly political. The bigger and bloodier the spectacle, the more the living remembered just how much power you wielded. A grand ship burial said, this was no ordinary mortal. The kind of message that keeps rivals up at night, nervously checking the logs and wondering if their own funeral will measure up. Now, if you're picturing every Viking sailing off in a blazing inferno, Hollywood has been working overtime on your imagination. The classic burning ship. At sea scene. It's dramatic, sure. Flames licking the sky as your ship drifts into the mist, while your descendants sob stoically on the shore. But in reality, the archaeological record tells a very different story. Actual ship burials, where the vessel is placed in the ground, loaded with goods and covered with tons of earth or stones, are far more common. The burning ship. That's mostly saga material, cooked up by poets and a few foreign eyewitnesses who couldn't resist a good story. There are a few exceptions, accounts from travelers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who describes a Rus chieftain's funeral involving a ship set alight with the deceased and their unlucky companions inside. But even that might have been more symbolic than literal, possibly using a purpose-built funeral structure rather than a full ship. After all, setting fire to a 70-foot long ship isn't exactly cost-effective. and Viking accountants were nothing if not practical. Still, the idea of fire mattered. It wasn't just spectacle, it was spiritual purification. A final transformation before you hit the afterlife's VIP section. Fire sent the soul upward, while burial anchored your legacy in the soil. And for a society obsessed with honor and memory, a burial mound was more than just a grave. It was a billboard, a permanent reminder to everyone who passed by that you once mattered. Let's get into the nitty-gritty rituals. The body prep wasn't just about making you look presentable for eternity. It was a performance. You'd be washed, dressed, and adorned, sometimes even posed as though peacefully asleep, because heaven forbid anyone thinks you died with a grimace. The weapons placed with you weren't just props. They were essential for defending your reputation in the shadowy boardrooms of the afterlife. And then things could get downright grisly. According to accounts from travelers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan, when a powerful leader died among the Eastern Vikings, the Rus, there was a tradition of sacrificing a slave girl, often chosen from among the deceased's household. For several days, she'd be treated like royalty, paraded about and pampered, only to be ritually killed at the funeral itself. The ceremony included chanting, drumming, heavy drinking, and finally, a disturbingly hands-on approach to ensuring no one traveled alone. To us, this seems horrifying. To the Vikings, it was the ultimate mark of loyalty and honor. Animals didn't fare much better. Horses were slaughtered to serve as afterlife, ubers, dogs as loyal companions, and hawks as feathered security guards. Sometimes, cows or even more exotic animals joined the party. In rare cases, the ship burial was surrounded by a ring of stones, marking the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead. A little extra insurance that no one would wander back uninvited. Depending on your status, your ship might be burned or buried. If you were truly elite, the ship would be entombed whole, preserved for generations. If you were merely upper middle management, a symbolic cremation might have to suffice. Either way, the key ingredient was spectacle. Viking funerals were less about private grief and more about public memory. The bigger the mound, the bigger the legacy. And those mounds weren't just piles of dirt. They were time capsules, packed with everything from gaming pieces to imported birds. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships, when unearthed centuries later, didn't just reveal the bones of leaders. They exposed the entire Viking worldview. Status wasn't just about wealth or battle prowess. It was about being remembered, about launching your story straight into history with a capital H. So, in the end, Viking ship burials were the ultimate blend of devotion, pageantry, and political theatre. They weren't just about sending you on your way, they were about keeping your name in the saga, making sure that for centuries to come, someone would stumble across your mound, sniff the unmistakable smell of legacy, and wonder just how many peacocks you managed to squeeze into your final voyage. And if you thought these spectacular send-offs were reserved for sword-wielding men, you might want to brace yourself. Because in the next chapter, we're about to smash some stereotypes. Forget the image of Viking women waiting at home, weaving by the hearth. You might picture Viking women quietly weaving by the fire and politely waiting for their men to come home from pillaging, right? Oh, please, you must be new here. In the tabloid annals of Norse society, the afterlife wasn't just a boys' club, and the ship burials prove it. In death, just like in life, some Viking women managed to command more awe, fear, and drama than any axe-swinging warlord. Seriously, if you were hoping for a restful eternity with a simple grave and a tasteful stone, you clearly never met the women of Oseberg. Picture this. It's 1904, and a farmer in Norway accidentally stumbles across what every neighborhood gossip dreams of. A scandal frozen in earth. Two women, one older and regal, the other younger and mysterious, lying side by side in the most extravagant Viking ship ever unearthed. This ship isn't some rough fishing boat. We're talking sweeping lines, fierce carved dragon heads on the prow, and planks so finely crafted you'd expect to see a celebrity's monogram somewhere along the hull. If this was a red carpet, you'd be tripping over silk. But here's the twist. This isn't a warrior's grave. No battered shield wall hero. No blood-soaked champion. The Oseberg burial is a queen's send-off, or possibly something even more dangerous, a vulva. Yes, you heard me. The vulva was a seeress, a walking scandal with a staff, a sorceress who could see the threads of fate and was absolutely not afraid to tug on them. If there was a spiritual hotline to the gods, she had it on speed dial. Look at the grave goods scattered around these women. There are staffs and wands, tools of prophecy, not war. Thus strange animal bones that hint at rituals you definitely weren't invited to. There's even a ceremonial sledge, woven tapestries, imported silks, and a bed that probably made every neighbor jealous. And don't get me started on the sacrificed animals, all packed in as if these women planned to run the afterlife, just as ruthlessly as they did the living world. If you thought power stopped at the grave, think again. In Viking society, spiritual power could outshine swordsmanship any day of the week. And speaking of excess, because no Norse funeral is complete without a little ostentatious flair, let's talk about the sheer wealth on display. We're not talking a few coins slipped under the pillow. Try sledges, carts, bolts of rare fabric, imported silks, ceremonial beds, and mountains of grave goods. It's like an episode of Afterlife Cribs. The Oseberg women weren't being shipped off to the next world. They were being crowned all over again. And the Oseberg burial isn't just a one-off fluke. Across Scandinavia, you'll find other graves that rewrite the script. The Gazelle Queen, for example, buried near Stavanger, went to her rest with gold jewelry, imported bronze vessels, and riding gear that practically shouted her status. Her grave gleamed with the kind of power that makes even the most hardened chieftain pause. Meanwhile, the Ladby ship in Denmark offers up hints of high-status female burials, and scholars still argue over whether some supposed warrior graves, decked out with weapons, might actually belong to women. It's not just speculation either. DNA evidence from a grave in Birka, Sweden, points to a high-ranking warrior buried with a full arsenal who was biologically female. That's right. Sometimes you were the shield maiden, sometimes you were the general, and sometimes you were both. So what's the real story here? Simple. In Viking culture, women weren't just allowed to hold power. Sometimes they took it with both hands and packed it in their luggage for the afterlife. Aristocrats, queens, seeresses, shield maidens, whatever the title. They weren't just supporting characters in someone else's saga. Sometimes they were the main event. When it came to the ship burials, women didn't just accompany the kings. Sometimes they were the kings. But let's talk about those grave goods. Because, as any palace insider knows, what you pack for the afterlife says everything about you. Viking ship burials weren't just about swords and silver. They were curated time capsules, a final dramatic biography written in wood, iron, silk, and bone. If you were anyone at all, your burial wasn't complete without weapons, swords with ornate hilts, spears, shields, and axes polished to a supernatural shine. These weren't there for ghostly battles in Valhalla, at least not entirely. They were status symbols, proof that you'd earned honor in this life and intended to keep it in the next. And here's a detail you won't find in most bedtime stories. Sometimes those blades were bent or broken before burial, not as an insult, but as a kind of weapon. Euthanasia. They had to die in order to follow you. Even your sword got a promotion. But it wasn't all war and glory. These ships were packed for a proper journey. Everyday objects, combs, cooking pots, whetstones, and even board games filled the nooks and crannies. Apparently, the Vikings didn't imagine the afterlife as an endless battlefield. Even the bravest souls needed to stay groomed, eat well, and kill time with a game of Nefertafel while waiting for the end of the world. It was less Grim Reaper, more full-service cruise. Animals were practically a requirement. The Gokstad burial alone came with a menagerie that would make a zookeeper weep: 12 horses, 8 dogs, and, because why not, 2 peacocks. That's right, peacocks in Norway. Are they a symbol of status? An extravagant joke? Or just the Viking version of bringing your emotional support animal? No one is sure, but it's safe to say that whoever staged this burial was not about to be outdone. And now for the part that really gets people talking at the afterlife: water cooler, the human sacrifices. Sometimes slaves or companions were dispatched to join the honored dead in their journey. Whether they went willingly or were simply volunteered by their employer is still up for debate. But their presence turns every ship burial into a dramatic ensemble cast. The message was clear: duty didn't end at death. And if you were unlucky enough to work for a particularly important Viking, you'd better keep your affairs in order. But nothing in these burials was random. Every item told a story. This sword meant you were a leader. That silk showed your taste. This pile of coins proved you had connections. Grave goods were a final resume, sealed and delivered to the gods. Once the ship was packed, sealed, and buried under a mound, it became a home beneath the earth, a floating palace, never to sail again. Or so everyone thought. You might picture all this drama unfolding only in Norway's icy fjords, but Viking ship burials were a pan-Nordic phenomenon. Each region gave the ritual its own twist, like everyone competing to host the most exclusive afterlife launch party. Norway, of course, is where you find the grandest mounds and the best preserved ships. The land itself, with its cool climate and generous soil, acted like a giant walk-in freezer, keeping these ships and their secrets fresh for centuries. The focus in Norway was always on spectacle. Mounds so big you needed a Sherpa, ships carved with mythic beasts, and grave goods displayed to impress both the living and the dead. It wasn't about hiding the deceased away. It was about staging a send-off that people would gossip about for generations. In Sweden, the style was a bit different. At places like Vendel and Valsgärde, you might not find the whole ship buried. Sometimes, just the outline of a ship was laid out with stones, a ghostly frame on the landscape. The Swedes liked to mix fire and stone, sometimes cremating the dead and placing their ashes within these stone ships. It was minimalist, symbolic, but still undeniably dramatic. Who needs a real ship when you can have a stone one? Move east to the lands of the Rus, those Norse adventurers who set up shop along the rivers of what's now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and you get a whole new level of theatricality. The most famous account comes from Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who watched a Rus chieftain's ship burial along the Volga. Picture this: a blazing ship, wailing mourners, and a send-off so intense you'd expect a film crew to pop out from behind a tree. Archaeologists haven't found many full ships in the east, but boat-shaped mounds and a familiar collection of grave goods show that the concept traveled well. It was always about the journey, the spectacle, and making sure everyone knew you were important, even on your way out. Denmark's ship burials are less showy, thanks to soils that turn wooden ships into mush. But stone ship settings and graves full of seafaring symbolism prove that the Danes were on board with the trend. Even in Scotland, Ireland, and the Baltics, you'll find boat-shaped graves, sometimes actual ships, sometimes just stones in the shape of one. Wherever the Vikings went, they brought the gospel of the ship as the ultimate vehicle, not just for raiding, but for crossing worlds. Now, let's get to the heart of the matter. Why ships? In Norse cosmology, water is everything. The world is encircled by a great ocean. Rivers separate the lands of the living and the dead. Life comes from the sea. And, naturally, that's where you return when your last party ends. Ships aren't just tools of war or trade, they're spiritual bridges. They're the uber black of the afterlife. In the old stories, ships are everywhere. Take Naglfar, the ship made from the fingernails of the dead, which will carry monsters to Ragnarok. Or Skidbladnir, the magical ship of the god Freya, which can fold up and fit in your pocket. Talk about carry-on luggage. These aren't just bedtime stories. They're blueprints. Every buried longship is a callback to these myths, a ritual performance of legend. A Viking ship burial wasn't just about honoring the deceased with a flashy coffin. It was a statement of cosmic intent. You weren't just being interred. You were being launched, sent on a voyage across the waters of death to wherever souls go next. Valhalla, with its endless feasting and fighting. Maybe Folkvanga, the field ruled by Freya. Half the Slanger there, by the way. She's quietly running her own afterlife empire. Or perhaps you ended up in hell, a realm for those who didn't die heroically. One thing's for sure, you didn't walk to your destiny, you sailed. And this wasn't just for the elite. Even more modest cremation burials often included a boat shape, sometimes stones, sometimes wood, marking the journey across unseen waters. The ship was both real and metaphor, a vessel for bodies and for souls. But let's not forget, every ship burial was also a performance. The dead were the stars, but the living were the audience. These funerals were a chance to show off, to rewrite the story of the deceased, to remind everyone just how important you were, and, by extension, how powerful your survivors still are. The pressure was enormous. If you were a Viking leader, you knew your funeral was being watched by rivals, would-be heirs, and that nosy gossip columnist lurking behind the tapestries, ready to report on whether your grave goods were up to snuff. And here's the final twist. 1,000 years later, these ships are still performing. They've traded the fjords for glass museum halls. The Oseberg, Gokstad, and Tune ships now rest under spotlights in Norway, admired by tourists who marvel at their curves and craftsmanship, who peer at the grave goods and wonder what it all meant. The ships were never meant to sail again, but they do across time, through the pages of history, and into the imagination of anyone who sees them. Writers, filmmakers, and game designers can't resist the drama. Viking funerals have become iconic, even if the TV versions take a few creative liberties. Whether it's a blazing send-off in a blockbuster or an animated dragon funeral, the spirit remains. Death is a voyage, and the ship is the ultimate symbol. Modern Scandinavians still feel the pull. Some descendants request sea burials or ceremonies inspired by the old ship burials, minus the human sacrifices, thankfully. Experimental archaeologists even rebuild these ships, launching them on rivers for a taste of the magic and engineering of the originals. What do these ships still teach us? Their wood reveals the forests of a lost world. Their construction shows a mastery of engineering to rival the Mediterranean. Their grave goods, peacocks, silks, coins, map out a Viking world far more connected and sophisticated than most people imagine. The ship burial wasn't just a funeral. It was a final show, a last act in a saga of power, performance, and myth. And now, as you stand in the role of Viking ruler, you know this. The dead were once alive. Myth and memory are always tangled, and some vessels never stop moving. They just sail on different seas. But if you think the Norse had a monopoly on funerary drama and romantic spectacle, think again. Across the North Sea, another kind of performance was brewing, a ritual of love, devotion, and elaborate contradiction, played out not in burial mounds, but in castle halls and gardens. Because courtly love wasn't about marriage, procreation, or building a stable home. It was about something far stranger, and maybe even more dangerous. Let's set sail for medieval Europe, and see how the heart became a battlefield. Let's get one thing straight, right from the start. If you're imagining yourself as an Egyptian pharaoh or a Viking warlord, tangled in the messy web of medieval courtly love, you're not hunting for a soulmate to settle down and raise a couple of adorable heirs. This is something much more dangerous, and frankly, a lot more theatrical. This is not the bedtime story, where the hero and heroine ride off into the sunset. This is the kind of love that leaves you sleepless, sighing dramatically at windows, and possibly composing poetry so overwrought it could make your enemies weep, or at least roll their eyes. Welcome to the world of courtly love. By the 12th century, this wasn't just a passing fancy among Europe's elite. It had become an entire performance, with its own unwritten rulebook, part seduction guide, part philosophical experiment, and, let's be honest, entirely out of sync with anything resembling real life. Picture yourself, not just as a monarch weighed down by a golden headdress or a fur cloak, but as the main character in a never-ending soap opera, where longing is the plot and suffering is the punchline. The birthplace of this spectacle? The sun-baked courts of southern France, especially Aquitaine. But don't confuse this with the passionate, messy, hands-on affairs you might expect. Courtly love was more about rehearsed gestures and carefully crafted lines than genuine emotion. It was performance art, staged for an audience of equally bored and restless nobles. If you're a knight, you pick a lady, preferably one who is already married, or so far above your station that she might as well be the moon. But instead of trying to win her over with, say, a nice dinner or a bouquet of wildflowers, your job is to adore her from a safe, reverent distance. You write poetry. You volunteer for perilous quests in her honor. You suffer spectacularly, in silence. Think of it as emotional masochism with a suit of armor and a really big audience. The rules of this game are carved in stone. Love must be secret. It must be difficult. And, most importantly, it must remain forever unfulfilled. Because the second you actually get what you want, the magic fizzles out. The suffering was the whole point. If you're not pining, you're not playing. So, the more hopeless the yearning, the more elevated your spirit. Your heartbreak is your trophy. Now, mix this tortured longing with chivalry, the original knightly operating system. It's not enough for you to be fierce in battle and loyal to your lord. You also have to be humble before your lady, worshipping her as if she just descended from Olympus. Love isn't a distraction from your knightly duties. It's a test of them. If you can endure heartbreak without letting it break your spirit or your code, congratulations, you're the gold standard. But let's not kid ourselves. For all the talk of restraint and virtue, courtly love was a masterclass in hypocrisy. You, decked out in the latest chainmail and reciting verses about your lady's golden hair and impossible grace, are probably describing someone who's married to a man much more powerful than you. And while everyone is pretending this is all very pure and noble, the walls of history are covered in the graffiti of scandals, affairs, and the occasional duel, fueled by all this supposedly platonic devotion. Yet, the fantasy caught fire. Poets, troubadours, and minstrels made entire careers out of spinning tales of knights who bled for love, ladies who wept for honor, and the never-ending ache of impossible desire. Whether or not anyone ever actually lived this way, the idea transformed how medieval Europe thought about love, power, and gender. Suddenly, love wasn't just a private emotion. It was a public code, enforced as strictly as any law. Long before Shakespeare or any of those sonnet-writing overachievers, you had the troubadours. These were not your average peasants singing about beer and barley. These were nobles themselves, fluent in multiple languages, well-educated, and fully aware that serenading another man's wife could earn you anything from a blushing duchess to a knife in the ribs. The troubadour movement started in Occitania, that patchwork of castles and vineyards in southern France, right at the turn of the 12th century. Picture a grand castle hall, candlelit and echoing with the click of goblets. The troubadour takes the stage, lute in hand, and launches into a song about unattainable love. The audience, lords, ladies, and the occasional gossipy cousin, hear their own secret desires reflected back at them. A single clever metaphor could make a duchess turn crimson. A truly scandalous verse might inspire a feud that lasts for generations. These troubadours didn't just invent the medieval love song. They invented the whole concept that expressing love through art was noble, almost holy. The vocabulary they invented was all about refined longing. It wasn't physical passion. They'd never admit to that. It was about admiration, humility, and the exquisite agony of unfulfilled desire. Love, according to these poets, was supposed to hurt. The lady was placed on a pedestal, sometimes literally, turned into a goddess who could never be touched. And the man, usually a knight or a poet, proved his worth by suffering for her, bearing his soul in lyrics that could make even the hardest warlord feel a twinge of something suspiciously close to empathy. Some of these troubadours were actual people you'd read about in the tabloids of the day. There was Guillaume de Bitius, who claimed to be in love with a woman he'd never even met. There was Bernard de Ventadorn, who turned heartbreak into a hit parade. And, of course, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who not only inspired countless tales, but also had the savvy to bankroll the poets who wrote them, and maybe even lived out a few of those stories herself. Their songs didn't stay locked away in southern France. This was viral content, medieval style. The idea spread to Italy, where the Dolce Stil Novo poets picked up the baton, and to Germany, where the Minnesingers made a whole industry out of it. Eventually it made its way to England, mutating and multiplying as it went. The troubadours didn't just entertain the court. They taught the court how to love, or at least how to pretend to. But if you think the woman at the center of all this attention was having a great time, think again. In the world of courtly love, the lady was everything. She was muse, judge, goddess, and untouchable prize, all rolled into one. She sat on her pedestal, both metaphorical and, more often than you'd think, literal. Knights rode songs about her, fought duels for her, and sometimes fainted dramatically at her feet. But here's the catch: she was rarely allowed to be a real person. Her beauty was described in the kind of language that would make a modern influencer cringe. Skin like ivory, eyes like stars, hair like golden thread. But behind all the poetry, these women were not individuals. They were living symbols, props in a public fantasy designed to inspire devotion and, more importantly, suffering. For men, this whole setup was a loophole. Suddenly, it was okay to be vulnerable. You could weep, sigh, and scribble poetry about your broken heart, and no one would call you weak. Your pain was proof that your love was pure. For women, though, it was more of a gilded cage. You were expected to inspire love without ever acting on it. You had to maintain your dignity and virtue while being watched, desired, and occasionally harassed by knights with more passion than sense. Every so often, a clever lady would turn the tables. Some stories tell of women who set challenges for their admirers, commanded loyalty, or even tested their knight's devotion with impossible tasks. But let's not get carried away. Most of the time, any power these women held was strictly symbolic. In real life, noble girls were married off for political alliances before they were old enough to know what was happening. Still, courtly love did give them a rare kind of visibility. In a world where men wrote the script, courtly love put women front and center, at least in the imagination. Some women played the game better than anyone. Eleanor of Aquitaine and her formidable daughter, Marie of Champagne, weren't just muses. They were patrons, commissioning poems and stories that reflected their own ideals, and, occasionally, their own maneuverings. But don't mistake this for equality. At its core, courtly love was about distance, not partnership. The lady was adored, but rarely known. She was a fantasy with a crown. And we all know, fantasies don't get to speak for themselves. Now, let's talk about chivalry. Originally, it was just a set of practical rules for staying alive on the battlefield. Loyalty to your lord, courage in the face of death, mercy for the fallen. These were the basics. But once courtly love crept in, chivalry grew a velvet lining. Every lance charge and every polished spur became a potential love letter. A knight's loyalties stacked up in a neat little pyramid. First God, then your feudal lord, and, finally, your lady. Where earlier warriors might have carried a battle standard, the courtly knight tied a lady's favor, a ribbon, a veil, maybe even a sleeve, around his arm. It wasn't much use as armor, but it made a fabulous statement. It was a public declaration that your sword was, at least partly, dedicated to romance. Tournaments, once just practice for real war, became elaborate theatre productions. The stands were draped with banners, and every knight paraded out, announcing whose favor he carried. Winning a tilt wasn't just about martial skill. It was your chance to prove yourself worthy of love. There are stories of knights collapsing from exhaustion, rather than risk the embarrassment of appearing less devoted than their rivals. That's right, chivalry, meet competitive suffering. If you think this all sounds exhausting, you're right. Manuals like Andreas Capellanos's De Amore spelled out the rules. A real lover stayed humble, courteous, and, most importantly, discreet. Guard your lady's reputation more fiercely than your own life. Endure jealous rivals without complaint. And, the cruelest rule of all, take joy in service, even if your love is never returned. The pain is the proof. But let's not forget the real world lurking behind all this velvet and poetry. Castles still needed garrisons. Bandits roamed the roads. Crusades were always looming. The same knight who wrote a tearful poem at midnight might be hacking off enemy helmets at sunrise. The hand that penned a sonnet could also wield a sword. Medieval commentators noticed the contradiction, but that was half the appeal. The more dramatic the contrast between brutality and tenderness, the more noble you seemed. Of course, real people have a way of ruining even the best fantasies. Affairs happened. Scandals erupted. Reputations shattered. But the ideal persisted, a delicate balance where courage and courtesy met, where a warrior's strength bowed to a lady's grace. In a world drowning in war and arranged marriages, that fantasy was irresistible. Chivalry, iron-clad but perfumed with longing, became the new standard for aristocratic romance. Fight hard, love harder, but preferably from a safe, poetic distance. Naturally, every code invites a breach. Courtly love, with all its secrecy and yearning, practically begged for real-world chaos. Beneath the flowery verses and tournament pageantry, temptation simmered. And when fantasy tried to become reality, things got messy, spectacularly so. Let's take a peek at one of the Middle Ages' juiciest scandals, Peter Abelard and Heloise. Abelard was the rock star philosopher of his time. Heloise, his brilliant teenage student. Their romance started out like a classic courtly tale, secret lessons melting into poetry and sidelong glances. But things got physical, then public, and then catastrophic. A furious uncle, a secret baby, a forced marriage, and, in the grand tradition of medieval overreactions, Abelard's infamous castration. Both lovers ended up in separate monasteries, writing letters that mixed theology with enough heartbreak to fuel a dozen troubadour ballads. Courtly love promised ennobling devotion. Reality delivered mutilation and a lifetime of regret. High politics wasn't immune either. Eleanor of Aquitaine, yes, Her again was rumoured to have entertained plenty of flirtations, not least with her uncle Raymond of Poitiers during the Second Crusade. True or not, the whispers were enough to help poison her marriage to King Louis VII and reshape the map of Europe when she moved on to Henry Plantagenet. Love songs could topple thrones. Royal daughters didn't escape either. The infamous Tour de Nesle affair in 1314 saw 3 French princesses accused, thanks to a maid's loose lips, of adulterous rendezvous in a Paris tower. 2 marriages annulled, lovers flayed and hanged, and the princesses banished to convent prisons. Chivalric rhetoric praised female virtue. The justice system kept the iron chains ready for when that virtue cracked. There were quieter tragedies too. Countless nameless ladies exiled to distant castles for exchanging letters. Knights marched off to crusade because someone suspected them of inappropriate devotion. Preachers delivered sermons comparing a wandering heart to a rusty sword. The church never completely outlawed courtly love, but church courts handed down plenty of fines for excessive familiarity. Even in poetry, passion came with a price. All these stories point to the same deep contradiction at the heart of chivalric romance. Society celebrated illicit desire while ruthlessly enforcing strict boundaries. You could sigh for your lady, but heaven help you if you acted on it. When vows broke, reputations burned, sometimes literally. So the dream of refined devotion collided, over and over, with the hard stone of medieval power. Courtly love could inspire the most beautiful poetry. It could also destroy lives. And every new scandal only added fuel to the fire, making the next forbidden romance even more irresistible. Because, as every court gossip knows, nothing spices up a love story like the looming promise of total ruin. If you're feeling winded by all this drama, don't worry, you're in good company. The story of courtly love didn't end in the castle courtyard or the pages of a troubadour's notebook. Its legacy stretched far beyond, shaping literature, religion, and even the way we think about love today. And that's exactly where we're headed next. If troubadours wrote the soundtrack of courtly love, medieval authors built the blockbuster cinematic universe. But if you thought troubadours were just the background music, think again. They may have strummed their lutes and moaned their way through castle corridors, but it was the writers, the true medieval hype men, who built the entire cinematic universe of courtly love. Picture this. It's the late 1100s, and you, as a freshly minted noble, are sitting in your drafty hall, already bored of the usual blood feuds. Then along comes Chrétien de Troyes, and suddenly longing, secrecy, and late-night anxiety are all the rage. Love isn't just a subplot anymore. It's the main act, the engine driving entire epics. Step into the world of King Arthur, a kind of medieval Marvel Studios, where every night is a potential franchise, and every scandal is one sword swing from going viral. In the story of Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, Chrétien doesn't just hand you a love triangle. He gives you the blueprint for every complicated relationship you've ever seen on screen. There's Guinevere, flawless and untouchable, married to Arthur, who mostly seems confused and vaguely disappointed. And then there's you. Well, Lancelot, but let's not split hairs. So peerless in battle, so tragically smitten, that you'll cross a bridge made of swords and take on entire armies just for a single glance from the Queen. But your true trial isn't on the battlefield. It's loving someone you can never, ever claim in daylight. The story has all the trappings, secret tokens, clandestine meetings, and the constant, delicious threat of total ruin. Readers ate it up, and suddenly every knight in Europe wanted to be Lancelot, except for the whole lifelong adultery migraine. Arthurian stories spread like a brush fire through the courts of Europe. Over in Germany, Wolfram von Eschenbach spins out Parzival, where the hero's spiritual growth is all tangled up with his commitment to pure, chaste love. Meanwhile, English poets start weaving together sprawling epic cycles. The Vulgate cycle, the Post-Vulgate, and eventually Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur in the 1400s. That one basically cements Arthurian drama into the DNA of Western literature. Love becomes both glory and downfall. A high-stakes game where the heart is always the last one to cash out. But not every literary romance comes clad in chainmail. Around 1230, Guillaume de Loris writes, "The Romance of the Rose," a dreamscape where the beloved is a literal rose, locked in a walled garden. Every courtly virtue, humility, courtesy, compassion, gets turned into a character, strutting around dispensing moral advice. Fast forward 40 years, and Jean de Meun picks up the story, adding a biting satire that roasts everyone from priests to nobles to the very love-crazed readers clutching the book. It becomes the medieval bestseller, copied in hundreds of manuscripts and argued about in universities. Was it a moral guidebook or a bawdy send-up? The answer is basically yes. These stories didn't just entertain. They standardized the whole language of yearning, love as service, the beloved as an unattainable beacon, jealousy as a dungeon. These metaphors became so popular that they turned into clichés, passed around by bards and moony-eyed teenagers alike. Even real courts started using these romances as etiquette guides. If you ever wondered exactly how to bow, flatter, or sigh dramatically in the right way, there was a literary reference for that. Here's where things get deliciously ironic. These romances did a double act. On the one hand, they celebrated everything the troubadours adored: bravery, devotion, suffering for love. On the other, they slyly exposed all the contradictions. Fiction made courtly love feel larger than life, more real than reality, ensuring that even peasants who never saw a troubadour still learned how to yearn with style. Now, don't think the church was just sitting in the back, humming along to medieval love songs. As troubadour refrains floated over castle walls, bishops caught a whiff of something less than holy. How, they wondered, could a culture that practically worshipped adultery, emotional idolatry, and elegantly managed lust possibly coexist with Christian teachings about fidelity and humility? Spoiler alert, it couldn't. At least not without an all-out theological tug-of-war. Preachers came out swinging first. By the early 1200s, sermon collections like Jacques de Vitry's Exemplar warned congregations about knights who left home for tournaments with a lady's ribbon and came back with a one-way ticket to damnation. The Dominican, Stephen of Bourbon, labeled troubadours as nothing more than vanity peddlers, arguing that their songs corroded both chastity and the fragile social order. Moralists even coined a special term, amour déréglé, or disordered love, to separate proper, marital affection from the poetic fever sweeping through the court. Church courts weren't about to let the matter slide either. A knight caught exchanging love tokens during Lent might find himself sentenced to a barefoot pilgrimage or forced to bankroll the church's candle budget, a literal fine for playing with figurative fire. Confessors' manuals started advising priests to grill penitents about secret affairs, suspicious poetry exchanges, even daydreaming, a little too dreamily. Suddenly, even desire was a taxable offense, payable in prayers. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. Repression was complicated by patronage. Some of the biggest fans of courtly love poetry were also major church donors. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Marie de Champagne, Blanche of Castile. These women wrote checks to monasteries with one hand and commissioned love poems with the other. Bishops might thunder against courtly verse on Sunday, but they'd be dining with poetry. Loving queens come Tuesday. In this medieval game of moral whack-a-mole, excommunication mostly stayed rhetorical. Social compromise proved a lot more practical. Some churchmen even tried a little sleight of hand. Andreas Capellanus's De Amor, legend says commissioned by Marie de Champagne, lays out 31 rules of love, only to end with a final chapter advising readers to renounce the whole thing as sinful nonsense. It's basically a carnival mirror, reflecting courtly ideals so precisely they start to look absurd. It's moral commentary in disguise, a manual that's really a roast. Satirists didn't miss their chance either. The Roman de la Rose, especially Jean de Meun's continuation, delights in showing courtly seduction as both entertaining and morally bankrupt. Jealous husbands pop up, nurses peddle tricks, and in the end, the heroine's virtue is breached, not with a flourish, but with a wink and a nudge. The poem becomes university study material, proof that sometimes laughter can cut deeper than an official curse. Despite all this backlash, courtly love survived for one simple reason. It offered something sermons never could: emotional drama. Let's be honest, nobody's skipping the theatre for a lecture. The church managed to slow the fever, trim its excesses, but it couldn't cut out the craving for romance. By the 1300s, moralists still thundered from the pulpit. But by then, the DNA of courtly love had already seeped into European culture. Cupid, a little more subdued, kept playing his tune, just softer, and with a nervous glance over his shoulder at the nearest bishop. By the mid-1300s, though, the glitter on courtly love was fading fast. Wars, plagues, and new money blurred the neat hierarchies that made longing from a distance feel so chic. Knights were now renting themselves out as mercenaries. Troubadours were competing with wandering jugglers. And, after the Black Death, Europe's mood swung from silk and sighs to sackcloth and survival. Still, the old language of love didn't just disappear. It evolved. Enter the age of courtesy. Courtesy books, like Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier from 1528, repackaged all those chivalric poses for Renaissance courts. No more bleeding under a lady's window. Now the polished courtier was all about sprezzatura, that effortless grace that made you the star of any dance floor or witty exchange. Yearning was still there, but now it came with a side of cool detachment. Love was still a game. The rules just traded chainmail for velvet doublets. Literature mirrored this shift. Geoffrey Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida, written around 1385, traps its lovers between courtly ideals and grim reality. Troilus worships with textbook devotion, but politics and plague smash the fantasy. Later, in the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer openly mocks knights whose flowery language outpaces their actual ethics. Audiences were starting to enjoy the parody as much as the passion. The printing press only made things wilder. Where hand-copied romances had been the privilege of the elite, now cheap chapbooks spread love's templates to merchants and artisans. Ballads like The Nut Brown Maid or Sir Aldingar distilled centuries of chivalric angst into catchy, miserable sing-alongs. Love talk became pop culture, less refined, more democratic, and increasingly tinged with earthy humor. Meanwhile, real politics started to gum up the works. In France and Burgundy, so-called courts of love, those mock tribunals where ladies ruled on matters of the heart, began fading away as kings realized romantic pageantry was a great cover for forming political cliques. Monarchs preferred loyalty oaths to love oaths, so much less messy. But the rituals didn't vanish completely. Tournaments still awarded prizes for the best-dressed lady. Young nobles still learned lute chords to serenade balconies, and heraldry manuals insisted that a knight might bear a flaming heart on his shield to honor a maiden. Even the first Valentine's Day poems, recorded in the 1400s, borrowed the courtly vocabulary of secrecy, service, and sweet pain. So, did courtly love die? Not a chance. It just shed its armor, slipped into silk, and waltzed right into the Renaissance. The dream of ennobling desire was too intoxicating to abandon. Europe just rewrote the script, softening the tragedies and selling the tropes to every social class. Love remained a ritual, but the stage sets kept evolving. Even as courtly love faded as a social practice, its DNA ran all the way through Western romance, like a guilty stain on vellum. When the Renaissance swapped chainmail for satin, Petrarchan sonneteers simply rebranded the unattainable lady as Laura, and Shakespeare turned the whole tradition inside out. Suddenly, Juliet is just as bold as Romeo, and the silent suffering ideal morphs into grand gestures, balcony speeches, secret letters, roses tossed beneath moonlit windows. These are medieval rituals in Elizabethan costume, and the crowd is still eating it up. The Enlightenment had its fun, mocking, chivalric excess, but still swooning over sensibility, that sweet ache of unspoken yearning. Jane Austen's heroines might roll their eyes at nights, but Darcy's silent devotion to Elizabeth is pure Lancelot, just with better manners and mutual respect. Romantic poets turned the pathos style up to 11. Think Byron's She Walks in Beauty, and Victorian etiquette manuals weaponized courtesy all over again. Calling cards, chaperone dances, even the language of flowers, every one a subtle nod to medieval symbolism. Tokens of devotion, carefully maintaining the illusion of restraint. Once the industrial city replaced the castle, love still demanded choreography, and society kept judging lovers by their mastery of coded signals. Cinema was only too happy to inherit this tradition. Silent film swashbucklers wooed their damsels with swordplay and soulful stares. And by Hollywood's golden age, the trope had traded armor for tuxedos and ballroom gowns. Every romantic comedy that waits a full 90 minutes for that one perfect kiss is just a courtly love story in disguise. The formula hasn't changed. Anticipation is always sweeter than consummation. Even superhero movies can't resist. Take Spider-Man, swinging across New York just to drop off a rose for Mary Jane. The setting has changed, but the devotion is exactly the same. And here's where things get really weird. Digital culture brings us right back to the Middle Ages. Online fandoms idolize celebrities they'll never meet, spinning out fan fiction the way troubadours once composed their songs. Emoji hearts and reaction gifs are just modern-day lute chords. The dynamic is identical: an exalted beloved, a yearning admirer, and an endless scroll of unfulfilled desire. Meanwhile, shipping wars are the new tournaments, except now, nobody risks getting impaled, just cancelled. Critics grumble that these patterns are artificial, maybe even toxic, and they're not wrong. Courtly love has always balanced on the edge of obsession, but the fact that it endures proves something deeper. Humans still crave a narrative framework for passion. We want rules, quests, symbols, drama. We claim to want realistic love, but the ticket sales and, let's face it, the endless romantic memes say otherwise. So here's your final headline, straight from the Palace gossip desk. The dream persists, because it flatters both our emotions and our imaginations. Whether you're a knight in dented armor, a Renaissance flirt, a Victorian wallflower, or just someone scrolling through endless profiles, you're playing out the same old script. The costumes change, the rituals shift, but the yearning, that exquisitely inconvenient ache, never goes out of style. In the end, being human means you'll always invent new ways to fall in love, suffer artfully, and hope for one perfect, impossible kiss. That's the real legacy of courtly love. And trust me, it's one scandal that never gets old.